Republican convention has concluded. We've now seen former President Trump and his new running mate, Senator J.D. Vance, out on the campaign trail. It gives a stark picture of one party that was in disagreement internally, divided internally, with what should come next. Should the president continue? If he didn't continue, who would step in? And now we know he's endorsing the vice president. That has been critical for Democratic officials who remind all of us as we're covering this that the base of the voter in the voter constituency in the Democratic Party is certainly Black women, and to bypass the vice president would have been untenable for many of them. Progressives had been standing by the president, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Those core constituencies were with him until he made this decision. And so it is notable that the vice president's team would now be thinking about potential running mates for her. I have been told that that process is now opening up, and there would be kind of a deep bench of Democrats who might serve in that role. One piece at a time. This decision today, announced publicly through his social media, obviously means there is a chance for the president to continue to recover from COVID. And when he addresses the nation, he will want to do that in full voice, feeling better, no longer positive for the virus, all of those kinds of things. We're all in this moment, and it is really extraordinary to have the president not seek re-election after he fought so hard to maintain his position at the top of the ticket, and many next steps that we will be exploring in the days to come before the Democratic convention. One source I talked to said if they were divided going into the convention, it would be a certain doom for the party. This allows some time to begin next steps and to try to get back on the issues that they believe are issues that can support a victory, even though there is turmoil on the ticket itself. So that's where we start off, Hallie, and I'll toss it back to you.
Kelly, thank you. Don't go too far, please. I want to report now from our colleague Mike Memley that a source familiar with the conversation tells us that President Biden did, in fact, speak with Vice President Kamala Harris today ahead of the announcement. I want to go to Yamiche Alcindor, who's been the tip of the spear in reporting on preparations that the vice president's team had been taking behind the scenes. In a way, Yamiche, that left open the possibility that President Biden may not take the move that he ultimately did today. Talk us through it.
That's right. Well, of course, this is huge news, but this is news that the vice president was preparing for. Now, of course, as your vice president, she is someone who had always been ready to take the job as president. But in the last few weeks, sources had told me that she was doing a really sort of distinct balancing act. She was both publicly and privately supporting President Biden while also quietly getting ready herself if she had to be the top of the ticket, which, of course, now with the president endorsing her, of course, her team is going to be hoping that she becomes the top of the ticket. So I've been talking to allies of the vice president who were laying out a path to victory possibly for her, because, of course, she's going to now be taking this step where she has to make up, they say, for lost ground here. So looking at what that might look like, they were talking already about making staff changes to the Biden campaign, possibly at the very, very top. They were also talking about sort of what a path to victory could look like for her. For President Biden, he was looking at Minnesota, at Wisconsin, Michigan. She might still be interested in those states, but sources close to her have told me that she's really interested also in looking at the South, African Americans in particular being a key part of the Democratic pace, and will be a key part of her because she's going to be, if she is selected as the top of the ticket, of course, this history-making candidate, being the first Black woman and the first South Asian American woman to be a major party tickets nominee. So I was told that Georgia and North Carolina were the places that she was going to be looking very closely at. So really what you see here is the vice president in some ways having to step into this role that people close to her had been really preparing for behind the scenes.
Yamiche Alcindor, thank you so much.
I also want to
go ahead, Yamiche, very quickly.
I also want to just point out that there were a lot of people that are really sort of talking about this open process and what that might look like. And from my understanding is that there are going to be a lot of women, especially Black women who are leaders of the Democratic Party, who are going to be saying she cannot be stepped over, that she cannot be put aside, that as the vice president, but also as an African-American woman who has been in and out of the White House and who, of course, speaks directly to the base of the Democratic Party, with Black women being the most loyal voters for Democrats. Yeah. From my understanding, they're going to really be pushing hard. So expect in the next few minutes, next few seconds, to hear a lot of Black women in the Democratic Party talking about the fact that she has to be the nominee. Allie.
Yamiche Alcindor, thank you very much. Again, significant news breaking today. President Biden withdrawing from the 2024 race, stepping off of the ticket, and endorsing his Vice President Kamala Harris, the start of a new moment in this presidential race. That does it for our NBC News special report. We'll see you tonight on Nightly and on NBC News Now.
In a second, but first, I'm curious what you think of a full female ticket, of a Harris Whitmer ticket. Just go big on the Democratic side and push back specifically at all that machismo energy that we got out of the RNC. Hulk Hogan on the stage, Donald Trump yelling "fight, fight, fight." It's a very masculine ticket over there. What about
be challenged in certain states? The House Speaker saying that as well. So just a monumental moment here that we are facing, obviously, and we'll stay on top of it, Katie, as we get more.
Julie Sorkin, thank you very much. Let's bring in NBC's Mike Memley. Mike, before I go to you, I want to read a little bit from a phone call that our own Garrett Haake had with former President Donald Trump. He told Garrett Joe Biden is the worst president in the history of the United States by far.
many of us believe could be in danger as events unfold. And I think before we race ahead, as we will never be due in about 5 seconds, because that's what we do in America. I think the country should take a moment and realize the magnitude of the decision that President Biden made for the good of his country, and certainly it's a respected reality here. He likes to say he's a great respecter of fate. And history and fate brought him to the pinnacle of power at a late season in his life. But I believe, and he is my friend. I help him when I can. So take this for what it's worth, though I am not a Democrat. I try to call these as I see them. I think he stood in the breach for us at a moment of creeping autocracy that was the creeping might be threatening to come into galloping. And he brought that set of skills. He brought that sensibility.
I haven't been through a situation like this. I'm 40 years old, so I missed it by 16 years. It's going to be one of those moments that in entire chapters, entire books, if you're studying American history, will be written about. How will Joe Biden be seen 56 years from now? What will have been written about him and what he did in this moment?
President Biden has remember how this drama started, Katie. We were a nation in the grips of a global pandemic. We were a nation where trust and faith in institutions was in a precipitous decline. We were coming through an era where so many people believed that the American experiment, the American consensus, which is not always commensurate to our problems, but a consensus that really had shaped us from Franklin Roosevelt through President Reagan, through President Obama, a world in which we saw politics as a means of resolving problems as opposed to going to total cultural war every single day. That consensus was facing an existential crisis. And President Biden, who beginning in his 20s, entered the public arena, a border state politician, right? Delaware is a complicated, small state, but complicated. A Roman Catholic part of the 20th century world. He learned the ways and means of the Senate. He learned the ways and means of America. And learned the world as a foreign policy guy. And then history and fate brought him to the vice presidency for one of the most historically interesting figures in American history, President Obama. And then it brings him at a point when we thought his political story was over. It was not. And rather like Cincinnatus, right, the ancient figure who was called to service, he ran in 2020. And in many ways, and let's also remember the personal side of this. And I want to say this very carefully. Whatever happens to President Biden politically will never be the worst day of his life.
No.
Because he's had two. He lost a wife and a child in a car accident. He almost lost his two sons in the same accident. And then he lost his son to cancer when he was vice president. He is a respecter of fate, as he says. And so he thought in many ways that he had passed the torch already to his son Beau's generation. And then fate passed it back. And he took the torch and he stood against a big lie. He stood against an insurrection. He stood against illiberalism. And he gave the Constitution another chance. That's what history is going to say.
He also stood against a global pandemic that was ravaging not only this country, but the world, and helped deploy the vaccine and get it under control. John, I'm going to steal this quote from Nick Kristof, who mentioned it in one of his recent pieces. It's attributed to Lenin, although there's argument about that. There are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. It's
right.
been one hell of a week.
It has. And it's, look, this is what history is. This is what life throws at us. And you know what it reminds me of, and I think it's probably worth on a summer Sunday for us to maybe take a moment or two. That may sound pretentious, but I'll say it anyway. I think we should remember that a democracy is the most human of enterprises, right? This isn't some clinical thing. It's not a monarchy that goes by tradition and native. It's not a birthright thing. This is a complicated, disputatious country that has chosen to try to recognize that each of us is created equal in the eyes of God and should be treated equally throughout our lives, that we are sacred and sacrosanct people. And it's really, really hard to run a democracy because it's about us. It's about those sacred individuals. It's about our habits of heart and mind. It's about how I see you and how you see me. And that gets down to a question of character. Democracies don't work if we don't give as well as take. And that's a counterintuitive human thing, because most people, including me, would much rather take than give. That's been true since the third chapter of Genesis, right? And so we have this, we've set the hardest possible task in front of us. And President Biden knows this in his bones. He understands the complexities of politics. That's why part of the decision he made today. He can read a poll. He can read a room. He can read a nation. And what he saw was that the wisest course forward was to let these values, let this vision of what the country should be carried on by those who share his vision in this hour. And if we don't see each other as fellow citizens and folks, as opposed to reflexive rivals and enemies to vanquish by Tyron and tweet and headline and attack every hour of every day, then democracies don't work. Because if every day is total war, if I have to win, if my identity is entirely determined by whether or not I win a particular political moment, then there's no way to recognize that the other person might be right. And I think what President Biden has done here, I really do. I think it's in the best traditions of the country. And I just, I can't say enough about what I think of as a brave decision.
John, if you were crafting an exit speech for a president and that president wanted to hand off the reins to his vice president, how might you write a pitch to the American public for that vice president?
I'm sure this is very hypothetical. I think, speaking historically, I think you say, I believe in an America where all people are created equal. I believe that prosperity and security and dignity and decency are vital American values, but they are not guaranteed. And therefore, it is essential for Americans to understand of the person to whom we give ultimate power, because ultimate power can be used for good or for ill. That's the story of our history. And so look as deeply as you can, my fellow Americans, at the values, the character, the vision of the person to whom you want to trust temporal power. And if you want that person ultimately to have the fates of your families in their hands, that's the person you should vote for. Character matters enormously here. We have seen this again and again and again because, as you said a moment ago about history happening so quickly, you just don't know what's going to hit that desk in the Oval Office. And so you better be very, very sure that you trust the judgment and the basic decency of the person that we send to that desk.
Hypothetically, of course, what that speech would sound like. John Meacham, thank you very much for calling in. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Katie.
President Biden told his senior team he had changed his mind about staying in the race at 1:45 p.m. today, according to a source with direct knowledge who was speaking to NBC News. The message last night had been full speed ahead. We got the announcement at about 1:55, I believe. So 10 minutes before President Biden told his senior team, those closest to him in the White House, that he would no longer be running. Joining me now on the phone as well, NBC News senior Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Haake. You know the news is breaking when everybody's calling in on a Sunday. Garrett, thank you for joining us. You spoke to former President Donald Trump. What did he have to say?
That's right, Katie. I reached the former president to continue your timeline probably about 20 minutes after the announcement became public. And he did not sound the least bit surprised and was ready to do really what John Meacham was just doing with you, which is try to shape the historical narrative here around Joe Biden, but to do it in a completely different direction. He described President Biden as the worst president in the history of the United States. He said there'd never been a president that had done such damage to our country. He went on to list a lot of damage had been done, most notably on illegal immigration, and said that he would fix what was done. I asked him if he was surprised at all about this announcement, if he thought, that he saw this coming, or if there was anything during their debate that sort of made him expect this was coming. And his answer to that was pretty short. He said he should have never been there in the first place in front of the president, and that he should have stayed in his basement. Now, to me, this is someone who is sort of continuing the campaign rhetoric against the candidate he's no longer campaigning against. But I think it also shows you something fundamental about the way that Donald Trump thinks about this race, or at least this race that was up until about an hour ago, which is there's none of the grudging respect that you might expect for a candidate that you just already faced off against 4 years ago and who defeated you. Donald Trump doesn't believe he lost that election. And you hear it in his answer to the last question, the idea that Joe Biden should have, in his mind, never been there. He thinks of Joe Biden as an accidental president, someone who stole the presidency from him, notwithstanding all of the evidence to the contrary. And I think he's quite sort of bitterly pleased with the result of this today. Now, I didn't get a chance to ask him about who he might face next or what steps his campaign might take, but I can tell you from my other reporting, he and his campaign are very pleased with the way things finished with his convention last week. They thought he had a good rally last night in Michigan. His vice presidential nominee is set to be on the road tomorrow, and they are putting the pedal to the metal here to try to really kind of run up the score in this interregnum between now and whenever the dust settles on the Democratic side and they know for certain who their opponent will be.
Garrett, we talked so much about Donald Trump potentially changing after the assassination attempt, after that brush with death that he had. Anything in your conversation today suggest to you that there's been a fundamental change in who he is?
No, and I don't think we should consider that possibility with much seriousness going forward either. I mean, look, I don't mean this in a pejorative way. Donald Trump is a 78-year-old man. He's been in public life for decades. He is who he is. And I think it's, there has been a lot of talk, a lot of speculation about the possibility that the brush with death that he experienced a little more than a week ago now might change him in some substantial way. And I just don't think there's been much evidence of that since. There frankly wasn't much evidence of it in the immediate aftermath, really about 36 to 48 hours afterwards when he kind of resumed his more political posts on Truth Social, and the tone was still the same it was, through the speech that we saw Thursday night in Milwaukee, which started with a kind of somber retelling of the events of Saturday night and then pivoted into his traditional kind of rally remarks, his attacks on Democratic politicians in personal terms, his aggrandizement of his own achievements in the White House. So no, I don't think Donald Trump changed then. And I don't think we should expect him to change now. I think what we will see is the pivot that will exist here is a pivot to who is at the center of his focus going forward, be it Kamala Harris or the next man or woman up on the Democratic side.
We've heard a little bit about Kamala Harris from the Trump team, especially a little bit more in the past week or so, as this conversation about President Biden was really starting to take off. Donald Trump Jr. Just a moment ago on X said Kamala Harris owns the entire left-wing policy record of Joe Biden. The only difference is that she's even more liberal and less competent than Joe, which is really saying something. She was put in charge of the border, and we saw the worst invasion of illegals in our history. That's an indication of how Donald Trump and his campaign is going to start going after Kamala Harris.
That's right.
Garrett, thank you. Joining me now is Rachel Maddow, host of the Rachel Maddow Show on MSNBC. Rachel, it's really good to have you.
Katie, thanks for having me.
Talk me through all your thoughts right now.
I was going to say, I apologize for looking like a boiled ham. I have no makeup on. I've just run in from nowhere near civilization. So it's nice of you to put me on. I mean, this is history writ large. We'll all remember where we were and what we were doing at this moment. And just thinking about the president right now, what a man, what a patriot. What an act of selfless devotion to your country. And he has been a phenomenal president. He brought us back from COVID. He gave us the best recovery from COVID of any major nation on earth at a time when the world has economically been struggling in the wake of COVID. The Biden economy is literally the envy of the world. He ended the presidency of Donald Trump at one disastrous term. And he did it while being decent and civil and honorable and normal and occasionally boring at a time when boring was absolutely what we needed. And I just, his career of decades in public service as a senator and as a very successful vice president and as a phenomenally successful president, there is no single thing that he has done in that entire career that is a greater or more consequential act of service and sacrifice to this country than what he has done today. And knowing him a little bit, knowing his personality, having spoken to him, a number of times in my life, both in sort of official and unofficial capacities, I cannot see anywhere in his personality where this decision today was possible. This is the opposite of something that is natural or easy for him. He is just not built to do something like this because his superpower is being underestimated. And that's why he's been so resolute in resisting all these calls for him to drop out. But him making this decision today is to give the country a chance, a reasonable chance at not putting Donald Trump back in the White House, not putting a president back in the White House who refused to leave the last time and summoned an angry mob to try to overthrow the government rather than go. This is Joe Biden saying, apparently it's not me, the one that gives us the best chance to do that. It's got to be somebody else. And so I will step aside. I'm just blown away by the sacrifice and the patriotism that this moment embodies.
Well, you're talking about being underestimated. I mean, ever since he first started running for federal office, he was at first too young to run. He just turned 30 after he was elected. He was seen as the young guy, not ready for this. And now the opposite of that spectrum calls for him to drop out because he had gotten voters thought too old. There was the 2020 race. I mean, I covered it. I was out in Iowa. I saw a lot of his campaign events, and he was underestimated then. He didn't look like he could win the nomination for the Democratic Party, let alone win the election. Again, this was right before COVID, and it was certainly before South Carolina and what Congressman Clyburn was able to do with getting him over the hill in South Carolina. But underestimated is exactly how he's always felt. Remember, President Obama didn't choose him to be his successor, passed over him for Hillary Clinton. Rachel, if you're talking to Democrats who are right now really nervous, really scared about what happens next and whether the Democratic Party can come together, what would you say to them?
I think that the Democratic Party was in really bad shape with the concerns about the enfeebled public appearance of the president. And that debate shook people, not only because it was one bad performance, but because it underscored, reified, and validated some niggling concerns that people had had about the president's age and his health and his capacity. And it absolutely split the Democratic Party into a million different pieces. And with that, with that status of the Democratic Party heading into November, I think that alone would have meant that the Democrats had essentially zero chance of prevailing in November. President Biden has endorsed Vice President Harris. I don't think there is going to be one whisper of a fight in the Democratic Party about getting behind her. I think that the Democratic Party will now unify like nothing you have seen from this party in many years around the necessity of supporting her and of building the kind of campaign you have never seen before to try to keep Donald Trump from returning to the White House and from undoing the American system of government. The endorsement of President Biden of Vice President Harris, I believe, I mean, I could be wrong, but I believe that will be seen as a period at the end of the sentence underscored, let's go. And it'll be, there will be technocratic stuff that needs to happen in terms of getting her at the top of the ticket and the delegates and the convention and all that stuff in the campaign. But this is not the start of an open primary. And if the Democrats want to start a primary in late July and thereby commit electoral suicide, I will be surprised. Democrats have surprised me before, but this means that Vice President Harris is going to be at the top of the ticket. And what this is going to mean for Joe Biden. I mean, by running with Barack Obama in 2008 and then serving ably as his vice president for 2 terms, he is part of history of the first Black president in this country. And what Joe Biden did today is going to get us the first Black woman president in this country. Kamala Harris is going to beat Donald Trump in November.
Kamala Harris has been a lot. Let's talk about Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, comes from a red state. not a state that's likely going to be won by Democrats, but potentially somebody who can speak to working class voters in the Rust Belt, the Blue Wall states, somebody who could appeal to them. There's also been a lot of talk about Gretchen Whitmer, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, because seeing two women on a ticket going after or going up against Donald Trump and J.D. Vance after all of the testosterone we saw at the RNC last week. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting prospect. I mean, I do think, I mean, Katie, let me turn the conversation back around to you just for a second. May I interview you for a second?
Sure, go ahead.
I just said that I think that the Democrats will now not have a fight over whether or not Kamala Harris is going to be the nominee. I really see this as like, it was becoming clear that was what was going to happen if President Biden dropped out. Now with his endorsement, it just seems to me like that's done. Do you agree that that's done, or do you feel like there's any wiggle room there?
And just by the conversations that I've been having on my text messages and the statements I've seen coming in, I had lots of conversations with lawmakers about what should come next. There was a lot of talk initially that it should be an open field. They should let Kamala Harris prove herself in an open field because an anointment would weaken her, whereas a challenge would strengthen her if she came out on top. That was the reporting that Nancy Pelosi was saying in private. But the second that this was announced, I started getting a flood of "Go Kamala, go Kamala." There was also at one point a pro-Kamala document that was being shared among big Biden donors, pitching her. And the more that I heard people talk about her, or the more that she was spoken of, the more that I heard big Democrats say, I think she does actually have a good chance at this. Elena Plot-Calabro wrote a great piece in The Atlantic, I'm sure you read it, about Kamala Harris and why she seemed to struggle in the first few months or first couple years of the being vice president. She wasn't being herself, essentially. She ran in 2020 in a moment when Democrats were saying defund the police. It was a very progressive moment. Law enforcement was front and center, but her whole history is of being a prosecutor, somebody who is, she says, smart on crime. You could argue tough on crime. And the question going forward is, which Kamala Harris are we going to see? Are we going to see a return to the roots, her roots as a prosecutor, as the attorney general in California, a place and a space where she is comfortable, especially running against a convicted felon? Or are we going to see the Kamala that we saw in the first couple years of the White House and maybe during the 2020 campaign? My instinct is to say that we're going to see more of the prosecutor, especially because of Rachel, who her opponent is.
Yeah, and I mean, Kamala Harris is not an ingenue here, right? Like, Kamala Harris is a known quantity. She has a long history in California politics and law enforcement. She has a substantial history as a senator, and now we've seen her operate on the national and international stage as vice president. I mean, the campaign for Kamala Harris to be the next president of the United States starts right now. I think that she will have not just a unified Democratic Party, but a turbocharged unified Democratic Party behind her. And it's funny, like, I do think you're right, Katie, that there's going to be an interesting fight about who ends up being her running mate. I don't really care. I mean, they'll pick somebody. I feel like the Democrats have a really good bench right now. And, maybe they'll pick Mark Kelly. Maybe they'll pick Pete Buttigieg. Maybe they'll pick Andy Beshear. Maybe they'll pick Gretchen Whitmer. Maybe they'll pick Raphael Warnock. I mean, Wes Moore. I don't know. Pick somebody. Maybe they'll pick John Tester. I don't know. I just feel like any of them would be great. Kamala Harris is going to be the next president.
You don't think they need to focus on Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and pick somebody from one of those states to ensure winning that state?
If picking somebody from one of those states ensured winning those states, then you would do it, right? But I think what they need obviously has to be somebody who Kamala Harris believes is qualified to do the job of president, right? That's the most important qualification. Has to be somebody who's a really good campaigner. Has to be somebody who has personal chemistry with the nominee, and it has to be somebody who's got chops for both doing the job and winning the job. And I just feel like there's a lot of really good options. And the fact that this contest, however, she's going to make this decision, is going to be one from a position of strength. I mean, you can feel the Democratic Party consolidating, right? Right now, as we sit here, you can feel it coming together. And that momentum means she's going to be choosing from a position of strength. And the next 3.5 months are just going to be lights out in terms of this campaign against Donald Trump. Donald Trump thought that he did not need to worry about winning this election because he thought that he was running against Joe Biden. And while Joe Biden has had a very good record as president, he was presenting himself as enfeebled in a way that was going to be very difficult for this campaign. Because he thought that he didn't really even have to compete very hard to win, he picked J.D. Vance. He picked somebody who isn't going to help him at all. The Republicans were going to win Ohio anyway. They did not need a 39-year-old ultra-conservative guy who idolizes Viktor Orban to try to consolidate new votes for Donald Trump that he wasn't otherwise going to get.
And
they picked J.D. Vance because they wanted him to govern the way that they wanted him for governing, not for campaigning. And Kamala Harris, I think, gets to pick somebody for both. And that's a better position to be in.
They wanted him for governing because he is aligned with Donald Trump, or the idea of Donald Trump that conservatives are pushing on policy. And one of those ideas is abortion. Donald Trump has said that he believes it should be left up to the states, but the apparatus behind him doesn't believe that. Project 2025 is saying that use the Comstock Act to ban the abortion pill from being shipped nationwide, ban the tools needed for the abortion procedures, ban them from being shipped nationwide across state lines, use the FDA to make the abortion pill even harder to get. J.D. Vance is somebody who said in the past that he believes in a federal abortion ban. I thought it was so interesting, Rachel, being at the RNC last week. Abortion didn't come up. They didn't talk about abortion at the RNC. Not once. Not once. And that is exactly what Kamala Harris has been campaigning on day in and day out for about a year now.
Yeah, and I mean, J.D. Vance, I mean, Project 2025 is really something on women's rights generally and women's role in the country and in society and in politics. It's really something. But, you know, just look at J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance signed on to a letter that says that prosecutors should be able to get women's medical records from out of state to pursue prosecutions for abortion. So if you live in a state where abortion is banned and you travel to California or New York or Illinois or someplace else to get an abortion in a state where it is legal, J.D. Vance wants prosecutors, law enforcement in your state to be able to get your medical records against your will from somewhere else you went in the country to pursue you across state lines so they can use your medical records in prosecutions. I mean, J.D. Vance on abortion is the worst case scenario you would invent for a barroom argument, for an inarguendo discussion with your friends about how bad it could possibly be. They picked J.D. Vance because they thought they had this election in the bag. And then Joe Biden did this today, and now it is an absolutely different ballgame. And J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are going to lose in November, and Donald Trump is going to regret picking J.D. Vance as his running mate now that he's up against Kamala Harris.
And J.D. Vance also at one point said he was against no-fault divorces, saying it's too easy to get divorced. And that's what has enabled women historically now to free themselves of some pretty violent marriages or just bad marriages. The idea that you can go in and say, it's not working for me any longer, I'd like out. He does not believe in that, or he said in the past.
He's explicitly said a woman in a violent marriage shouldn't be allowed to get out of it, specifically talking about violent abuse by a husband. He thinks a woman should be made to stay in that marriage. I mean,
so if you're talking about this, don't you want to see a woman debating J.D. Vance in a vice presidential debate? Do you? I mean, you have a Kamala Harris going after former President Trump now in a debate. If it happens again in September, let's see if the debates change. But wouldn't the positions that J.D. Vance has taken on abortion, on divorce, on violent marriages, wouldn't that be, you know, the red carpet being rolled out for a Gretchen Whitmer to stand there next to him and to say, here's what you believe?
I mean, sure, but given what he believes, I mean, I'd be happy to watch a protein shake debating him. Like, I don't think it matters. I mean, any Democrat who can talk about those are issues, the kinds of issues where J.D. Vance has taken the kinds of stands that you and I have just described over these last few minutes. Those are not 50-50 issues in this country. They are not 60-40 issues, 70-30 issues. He's taken the kind of stances that single digits of Americans support. You do not need any type of Democrat in particular to prosecute a case against J.D. Vance. He is a real weirdo from a really, really, really narrow slice of the very far right side of the ideological spectrum. They picked him because they didn't think he'd have to be defending himself at all, because they thought they were going to win this in a walk.
Well, they picked him because they said they wanted to sit him down in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the three states that we're going to talk about ad nauseum going forward. They thought that he'd be able to speak to white working class voters, the people that he grew up with. Rewriting history a little bit about what he wrote in his book, Hillbilly Elegy, about those groups of voters and this idea that they were blaming everybody else when they really needed to look inward to see what they were doing to contribute to their own not so great position.
This is a guy who's given a series of jobs by a very far right eccentric billionaire who says he doesn't believe in democracy, right? J.D. Vance's entire career was jobs given to him by Peter Thiel, who then gave a larger donation than has ever been given to a single Senate candidate by a single donor ever to get J.D. Vance his seat in the United States Senate. Same guy who gave him all his jobs also put him in the United States Senate. There's a reason that Peter Thiel himself is not running for office. It's because he believes that democracy and freedom are not compatible. It's because he thinks everything's gone downhill since women had the right to vote. He once proposed that America not only should be abandoned, but it should be abandoned by conservatives for shipping containers that they should float into the ocean and govern as libertarian paradises, right? I mean, this is not normal stuff. And this is the guy who created J.D. Vance. He is only 39 years old. He has essentially been Peter Thiel's intern for his entire adult life. Honestly, it doesn't matter who's going up against him. With Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, nobody is going to pick Donald Trump and that guy instead of her.
What about the people, and I'm getting messages like this from friends of mine, girls, women, who are worried about sexism, worried about having a woman at the top of the ticket, worried because they thought that Hillary Clinton lost because this country was too sexist to elect a woman.
Yep. I mean, yes, but does that mean that a woman should never run for president? Nope. And at this point, the vice president of the United States is Kamala Harris. She's done an able job as vice president. She has the endorsement and was chosen by Joe Biden for just such an occasion. He's endorsed her. She's the nominee of the Democratic Party. And it's now the job of everybody in the country who does not want Donald Trump to be the next president to get her over the top. That's it. I mean, yeah, you can worry about it, but you know, that and a bag of chips. Sorry. It's just the task is upon us. Here it is.
Here's a statement from President Clinton and Secretary Clinton, speaking of which. President Biden has capped his extraordinary career of service with a presidency that has lifted America out of an unprecedented pandemic, created millions of new jobs, rebuilt a battered economy, strengthened our democracy, and restored our standing in the world. By any measure, he has advanced our founders' charge to build a more perfect union and his own stated goal of restoring the soul of our nation. We join millions of Americans in thanking President Biden for all he has accomplished, standing up for America time and again, with his North Star always being what's best for the country. We're honored to join the president in endorsing Vice President Harris, and we'll do whatever we can do to support her. We've lived through many ups and downs, but nothing has made us more worried for our country than the threat posed by a second Trump term. He has promised to be a dictator on day one, and the recent ruling by his servile Supreme Court will only embolden him to further shred the Constitution. Now is the time to support Kamala Harris and fight with everything we've got to elect her. America's future depends on it. Let's talk about how the campaign might look, Rachel, because we got from President Biden while he was running a lot of talk about democracy, a lot of talk about the threat that Donald Trump poses January 6th. We didn't get as much or as forcefully on the economy. And this is a White House that has a really good economic message to run on, a really good economic message to sell to the American public, and a future economic policy to promise them will keep doing well. Do we see Kamala Harris, or should we see Kamala Harris focusing on the threat of democracy, or should we see her focusing more toward kitchen table issues like the economy? And I ask that because I've gotten the sense as I've been traveling and I've been talking to voters around the country that the people who are worried about democracy, they're already going to vote for the Democrat. They're already gotten by the Democratic Party. They see it as a threat. They don't need to be told twice. But the people who are on the fence are the ones who were, didn't think Joe Biden was right for the job. He was too old, or was too old white men. They didn't feel inspired by the election. Or two, felt like they didn't know what they were voting for in the future with the Democratic nominee. Or three, were worried about economic issues, pocketbook issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is yes. I think we will see Vice President Harris do both. I think that we will see her talk about the stakes of this election, right? Part of the way you run for president is by talking about what you will do. She can run on the Biden economy. She can run on the achievements of the Biden presidency. She can run on her own achievements as vice president. She can run on her own ideas that we heard her articulate as a presidential candidate herself and as a senator, and indeed as somebody in law enforcement and as a prosecutor and attorney general in California. We'll hear all of that from her. But the other way you run for president is by telling people why it's really important that the other guy not get in. And those are the stakes when it comes to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump certainly is proposing some stuff that economically is going to provide real fodder for the campaign. This tariff idea that he has, which is going to radically raise prices for all sorts of household goods, for everything that normal people spend money on all over the country, is, it's an economic issue that she can use against him. But honestly, it's hard to put aside the fact that the last time this guy had the presidency, he tried to hold on to power by force. Like there's no percentage in eliding that, I think. And so I think Vice President Harris is good on the issues in terms of her own, what she's promising and what she wants to do for the country. But Donald Trump is not running as an incumbent, but he is running as a former president, and his record and what he's proposing now and his extreme new running mate, it's all just very, very, very fertile ground for a unified, democratic, and newly energized campaign. I feel like from where I'm sitting right now, again, looking like a boiled ham, I'm sorry that I'm not wearing any makeup, but from where I'm sitting right now, I feel like I can hear checkbooks opening and wrists swiveling as donors on the Democratic side. Everybody to the left of Attila the Hun is now turning to the reality of a new Democratic candidate and a new prospect for keeping Donald Trump from getting back into the White House and presumably not leaving for life if that's the way he's thinking about things.
He's running on a record, and you laid out the record. Donald Trump is running on a record that was capped off by his refusal to leave the White House. Vice President Kamala Harris will be running on the record of this White House. At the top of this interview, Rachel, you mentioned that the United States has an economy that the world envies. That's true. Mm-hmm. The rest of the world has had a much harder time coming out of COVID. They've had a much harder time bouncing back. China, much harder time bouncing back. The UK, significantly harder time bouncing back. That's why they just decided to throw out the conservatives in the bin just a couple weeks ago and elect a new Labour government for the first time in, I think, 14 years, because the economic situation in the UK has been so bad. Austerity has done nothing for that country. The exit from the European Union was terrible. So when we are doing well, when we have job growth, when we have inflation coming down, prices coming down, when the unemployment record in this country is at near historic lows, to say that we are the envy of the world is not hyperbole. We are the envy of the world right now economically, and Vice President Kamala Harris does have that record to run on. Can she convince Americans who don't feel great about the economy, the bad vibes economy? She's going to have a task in front of her to do that, but I guess the argument is that she can do it much better and more forcefully than President Biden could. Rachel, hold on a second. Let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, who's got some fresh reporting for us. Monica, what do you have?
Well, Katie, I think it's just so notable in everything you've just been discussing there when we talk about the factors that went into this decision for President Biden. We have to remember he's isolated in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware with COVID, and that's where he has been these last couple of days, having some of these difficult discussions, I'm told. But ultimately, even last night with some of his closest aides, with members of his inner circle, he had told them privately, I understand, that he was full speed ahead, that he wanted to continue with this campaign. Even this morning, some key White House and Biden reelection effort surrogates were on the airwaves saying this isn't a discussion about President Biden making a future decision. They had said he had made his decision and it was to stay in the race. And some of those people didn't even find out about the president changing his mind until just moments before it went out formally on his own account on social media. That's how closely this was held. But Katie, I think it's really important to remind our viewers of who was around the president when this was happening these last couple of days. And that's his real close and immediate family. And in large part, that is because of his COVID diagnosis, but also because we knew, and we had reported, NBC News knew these conversations were happening a couple of days ago, that there was this awareness and acceptance of a more reality-based conversation that needed to take place about if the president were to leave the race, what it would look like. And the people closest to him, his family, we reported, were really talking about this in the context of wanting to make sure that if this happened, it would be befitting of a public servant who had been in elected office for more than 5 decades. And that was a really important part of this story. Once we knew that that was happening, there was an acknowledgement from within the people who know the president the best that this was a more than likely possibility. It wasn't talked about as any kind of a foregone conclusion, but the fact that those conversations were even happening, I think tells you a lot, and it tells you a lot about these last couple of days. And we know he has been with the First Lady, who, by the way, is supposed to be going to the Paris Olympics to be at the opening ceremony in the coming days, heading there. So that is something to think about when we're now talking about where President Biden will give a larger speech, laying out this thinking and giving this formal notice of this decision to the American people. And we believe that that will be a speech in the coming days, as he hinted at in his letter. But they want to make sure, again, that so much of this was going to be calculated, according to the people that I've talked to and just spoken with, on his own timeline. And there were many around him who were very close to him who still believed that there was more time to that timeline. They felt like they had maybe bought some time with some of these forceful statements. With this decision to be back on the campaign trail, he had said just in a statement on Friday, he had pledged to be back talking about Project 2025, to be talking about former President Trump. And now here we are 48 hours later with this very, very significant decision. And something else, Katie, that just happened in the last couple of minutes is we're hearing from former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who obviously played a very key role behind the scenes in talking to members of the Democratic caucus, certainly in talking to people around the White House, in expressing her own concerns. We reported about Joe Biden's path forward here. And notably, she is saying here, she is praising him as a leader. She is talking about his greatness and that he will go down, she says in this post on social media, as one of the most consequential presidents in American history. But I think it's interesting also there, Katie, what she's not saying, which she isn't endorsing, at least outright in those posts, Vice President Harris, the way that we have seen President Biden do, and the way that we just saw former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton throw their support formally behind Vice President Harris. So that is another really key portion to this story and where it goes from here. And we know that the president and the vice president did speak earlier today ahead of the announcement. We know that Vice President Harris is here in Washington, D.C. today. She had a mega fundraiser yesterday where she was really praising her own president's leadership, saying that it was going to be Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. And again, she was one of the people and the people around her who had been told as recently as last night and this morning, there is no change to the thinking. The president fully intends to stay in this race. So this was really something that was clearly closely held. It was something the president had reflected on for some time. And remember, Katie, when he had been asked in the last couple of weeks if there was anything that was going to change his mind on this, initially he said, well, if the Lord Almighty Almighty comes down and asks me to reconsider, I'll do that. Just a couple of days ago, he had shifted that a little bit to some kind of medical condition that wasn't known if his doctors told him to do that. And now here we are on this day where we know the president did come to that conclusion ultimately, that for the interest, he says, of his own party and the country, that he is not the person to be the Democratic nominee in November. Katie.
He also said he was shown that he doesn't have a path forward, that he couldn't win, then he would step aside. The Congressional Black Caucus has now endorsed Kamala Harris. I want to talk to Rachel about the other statements that you mentioned, Pelosi not mentioning Harris, but Monica, if I can just get you for one more second, if you don't mind. Do we have any idea about a timeline for when President Biden is going to make this announcement in person? Is it going to be an Oval Office address, usually reserved for more somber announcements, or potentially something from the Rose Garden with Kamala Harris standing beside him, more of a passing the torch and potentially celebratory moment? Do we know anything about that?
We don't know anything specific yet, Katie, but the president is supposed to be coming back to Washington once he tests negative. And we know that that could happen in the next couple of days, but hasn't happened yet. He's supposed to be meeting with his Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That had been a major meeting that was on the books before his COVID diagnosis. He was supposed to be having a couple of other events. So I'm sure they're going to obviously clear the schedule for something of consequence, as you point out, and he will decide. But I know, given what we had reported about the family conversations and even among some senior staff, they had already begun to map out what that address might look like as early as last week, at least in a very preliminary phase. So I think now begins the real work of putting that into motion. But when we do write about this in the history books, the fact that the president has COVID is sort of a weird footnote to all of it, because it means that he couldn't come out and speak about this today. We understand he's still pretty hoarse. He still has a pretty bad cough, according to his own personal doctor. So that's also something that's factoring into this, in addition to all of the other incredible factors that have contributed to this big news.
Well, I mean, you can also probably make the argument that COVID helped him get elected in 2020, and maybe COVID helped him make the decision to step aside in 2024, a parallel there. Rachel, let's talk about these statements. Monica just mentioned that Nancy Pelosi didn't endorse Kamala Harris. Let me read Nancy Pelosi's statement. President Joe Biden is a patriotic American who has always put our country first. His legacy of vision, values, and leadership make him one of the most consequential presidents in American history. With love and gratitude to President Biden for always believing in the promise of America and giving people the opportunity to reach their fulfillment, God blessed America with Joe Biden's greatness and goodness. What do you think of the lack of Harris endorsement? My impression is that this is a moment for Joe Biden, and that endorsement for Harris, if it comes, it'll come after a beat is given to President Biden, some respect and some space.
Yeah, I think that's right, Katie. I think that this is a moment to recognize the grace of what Joe Biden just did. And, you know, I'm as eager as anybody to think about what this campaign is going to be like in the next 3.5 months. And, you know, I'm interested to see who Kamala Harris is going to pick to be her running mate, and, you know, how the politics shape out around all the issues and what the Democratic convention is going to be like. Yes, but actually right now, I'm sort of with Nancy Pelosi on this in terms of my own feelings, which is what Joe Biden has just done has made American history forever, but it's also one of the most selfless things a president could do. And, you know, even when you think about other presidents who chose not to run again, like when LBJ chose not to run again, it wasn't for a reason like this, right? It wasn't that he thought he had the best shot at it, but it wasn't anything like that. Joe Biden absolutely, we've heard him over the last several weeks, is absolutely committed to the idea that he needs to finish the job, that he would be the best candidate against Trump, that he knows how to run against him, that he's got much more that he wants to get done. Like, we know how he feels about that. And yet, he listened to counsel. He put his ego aside, listened to counsel about what was best for the country, listened to counsel about the risk that he was putting the country at in terms of Trump potentially returning to power because of his age, purely because of his age, not because of anything else. And, you know, Nancy Pelosi is a person of faith. She's a deep Catholic faith, and she references that, I think, particularly in big moments. And I think you see that in that statement from her today. I will be very surprised if Nancy Pelosi doesn't soon endorse Kamala Harris, just as every, I think, Democrat in public life will now endorse Kamala Harris as the top of the ticket. I think that consolidation will happen rapidly. The fact that it didn't happen instantly and at the same moment she was marking this incredible act by President Biden, I think is not really a surprise.
Let me just insert just a moment of skepticism here, because we had seen reporting that Nancy Pelosi wanted kind of a mini open convention. She wanted there to be some conversation, public debate between some potential candidates to be at the top of the ticket. This was reported by a number of outlets. She knows how to count the votes. Queen of counting the votes. She understands how politics works. She understands how elections work. She's the muscle, the godmother of the Democratic Party. She had been arguing that Kamala Harris needs to be strengthened by a fight. Anointing her would weaken her, that she needs to prove herself. Could we potentially see Nancy Pelosi make that argument publicly? Or would it be just too weird for her to go against President Biden publicly again after he's already thrown his support behind Kamala Harris?
I mean, that's the thing, right? Is that now that President Biden has done this, I think it's, while I think that made sense as an abstraction, now that we are in the lived experience of it and President Biden has unequivocally endorsed Vice President Harris, like, I think that kind of ends the conversation. I mean, you know, maybe we'll see Dean Phillips come back. Was that the guy's name? Dean Phillips. We'll see him come back and like try to mount a primary campaign here. Or maybe we'll see, I don't know, somebody else say, no, it ought to be me. But I just find it hard to believe that that any Democrat who wants to prioritize beating Donald Trump in November, which I think every Democrat does, would now want to start a new process of questioning President Biden's endorsement of Kamala Harris and questioning her readiness for the job. I mean, it just, again, anything is possible. I have learned not to be surprised anymore, ever, by anything. But I would expect that the endorsements for Vice President Harris will run in a pretty consistent stream over the course of the day, and the campaign effectively starts tonight.
I think 2016 really taught us that message. Never be sure of anything, because the world is much more complicated than you think it is. Rachel, I want to let you go, but I have one more question for you. Forgive me for hogging all of your time today, all of your afternoon. Okay. So we're seeing a lot of statements of support and approval, congratulating Joe Biden on his service and on this incredibly difficult and brave decision that he's making to step aside. That's from Democrats. From Republicans, we're hearing statements that if Joe Biden can't run for office, then he should step aside. He can't be president. We're hearing a lot of that from the Elise Stefanik's of the world, from allies of Donald Trump. We're not hearing Mitch McConnell go quite that far. But what do you make of the calls from within the Republican Party for Joe Biden to step aside? And this is obviously something they're going to start trying to campaign on as well. The Democrats had been hiding him. He's not healthy enough to run. He's not healthy enough to lead. You can't trust them with the nuclear codes.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, I don't mean to be too flip about it, but I think the Republic, to see Elise Stefanik out there leading with this messaging kind of tells you all you need to know in terms of whether or not this is coming from a good faith place. I think that President Biden has done a remarkable thing in choosing not to run for re-election and to instead endorse his vice president. And that's the news of the day. And Republicans are going to, pull all sorts of things out of hats to try to prosecute the case against the Democratic Party, against Vice President Harris. They'll continue prosecuting the case against Joe Biden in the remainder of his presidential term. But at this point, I feel like if you were under the impression
What it do, what it do. Make sure you like, subscribe, share, comment to my YouTube channel. Most definitely hit that bell icon and notification. That'll alert you to all content that drop my YouTube channel. Make sure you hit the thumbs up, the aka the like button. And make sure you hit the subscribe button. All three helps my channel grow. All three helps my channel get more views, more subscribers, and push it further to the YouTube galaxy. It's all about making this channel grow, monetizing it. I need all my subscribers and future subscribers to hit the Cash App. All content, all information pinned at the bottom of the screen. Support the channel. You see the title, breaking news, Joe Biden drops out of presidential campaign. We knew it was coming. Kamala Harris will probably be running for the Democrat side. Who the vice president candidate gonna be, we don't know. But this is gonna be a tight, very interesting race. This is the channel where you get all your news, topics, everything about the presidential race. I told you, S.L.R Media TV, we everywhere. We're gonna cover it. So I need all my subscribers to hit that notification when I drop. Like I said, this is very important. This is more important now that everybody get out and vote. And as I say again, it's gonna be, hey, as the news comes, we're gonna drop it. If Joe Biden eventually has that time when he coming out the COVID, he's gonna let everybody know what's coming out. This is the channel where you need to log into. So I mean, everybody to hit the notification. Make sure you get your subscribe button. Make sure you get the like button. Get out and vote. Joe Biden is out. Kamala Harris is in. Let's go. Like, subscribe, share, comment to my YouTube channel. You know what to do. Subscribe and support the channel. Hit the Cash App. $, all caps, SRED 40. I'm looking for co-hosts. I'm looking to give out moderators. I'm looking for mods, ready to give out wrenches. Hit the email or hit me up when you see me go live and let me know you want a wrench. I'm out.